again Galatians chapter 2. Paul's writing to the churches in the region of Galatia. Main purpose is to correct a falsehood that many of the believers had fallen prey to, that being a works-based righteousness, which caused them to live lives focused upon religious rules rather than a living relationship with the Lord. As we pointed out earlier, Paul said in verse 6, I marvel, chapter 1, that ye are so soon removed from Him that hath called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. They had moved away from Christ in their manner of living their lives. And as you read through the book of Galatians, we're not going to take the time, but as you read through, you'll see many consequences of living a life apart from Christ. So in Galatians 2, verse 20, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me. Again, he's describing the Christian life. And our subject is a description of the Christian life, part 2. And as you read Galatians 2, verse 20, you need to think about who wrote these words and the life that he lived. Paul is the writer. And Paul was a man whose life had a far-reaching influence and impact upon God's people, upon the Lord's churches, and even upon the unsaved. These are the words of a man whose life was one of widespread encouragement and blessing. His life was an incentive to God's people. His life was an incentive to the Lord's churches. These are the words of a man who was marked by godly character, by courage, by strength, by assurance, perseverance. So what is being described here? No one could deny that Paul's life was a very useful life. It was a very meaningful life. A very productive life. A life that manifested and glorified the Lord. And it's as we've already seen, it's an individual life. It's personal. It's a life for now. It's a life with a pivot point. I'm crucified with Christ. We want to see some other things concerning this life. This would be the fourth characteristic. It is a life lived with new identity. Notice, I, who I was in the past, am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ. He's speaking as one who had surrendered his identity in Christ. And as you read the verse, you see that basically I has been replaced by Christ. The old life was nailed to the cross. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. I am crucified, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ. There's been a transformation in his life. He is saying, my old life is crucified, and life is no longer a manifestation of the old me, but life is now a manifestation of Christ. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. I live. Yet not I, but Christ. So you see, Christ has replaced I. I believe there's also a change in tone at the nevertheless. So it is, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless, and the tone changes. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ. He's saying, my old life is crucified, but I'm truly alive. I'm more alive than I've ever been. And I have a better life than what I had before. And now it is not I, but Christ. Not I, but Christ. Say those words over and over and over. Not I, but Christ. That is the Christian life. Paul is saying, I am no longer the focus. I am no longer the purpose of my life. I am no longer the center of attention. I'm no longer the emphasis. Christ is the focus. Christ is the purpose. Christ is the emphasis. Again, not I, but Christ. Concerning my will, my plans, not I, but Christ. With regard to responsibilities, opportunity, whatever, not I, but Christ. And this is so whether it be a time of joy, whether it be a time of difficulty, whether it be a time of trial, whether it be a very calm and peaceful time, or whether it be a storm time. Not I, but Christ. That's the Christian life. Paul is saying concerning the decisions in life, life is filled with decisions, choices. Not I, but Christ. Paul is saying concerning his motives and his aims and his goals, not I, but Christ. This is so through all the conditions and circumstances of life. It's true concerning family. It's true concerning relationships, emotions and feelings. All those things are very real. Paul says, not I, but Christ. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ. There's a new DNA. I is no longer his DNA. Christ is. A new identity. A new identity. And it's Christ. And this is the life that is being described and cannot be lived unless there is a new identity. Something has to change before we can live this life. In our text, and we've pointed this out in the past many times, there's two people. There's I and there's Christ. Two persons, two entities. And something must be done with both of them. And we do something with both of them. We have to do something with I. We have to do something with Christ. And we do. And what you do with I and what you do with Christ determines the life that you live. I and Christ. You got to put them somewhere. You got to put I somewhere in your life. You got to put Christ somewhere. And if it's not I but Christ, then things are off center. Things are out of order. Fifthly, it is a life with a new power. New identity, new power. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ. Christ is the alternative to I here. Liveth in me. That's the power to live this life. Christ liveth in me. When Saul at the time, was persecuting Christians, Christ was not in him. It was all I. But he says, now, Christ lives in me. And notice it's not just Christ in me. It says more than that. It says Christ liveth. Ongoing. Christ liveth in me. That is, He's active in me. He's manifest. He's alive in me. Paul says that the degree of such is that it's no longer I that live, but Him. He's alive in me. Think about this. The one whose life upon earth served as the perfect example and pattern liveth in me. The one whose life was pure and holy. Paul says He lives in me. You can't have this one living in you and it not make a difference in your life. The one who lived his life as the perfect servant of God. Paul says He lives in me. This one who was always doing the will of God. He lives in me. This one who was always diligent in doing the Lord's work, whose life was entirely committed to God. He lives in me. The one who just took great delight in serving God, and he took great delight in doing the work of God. He lives in me. One who lived his life in perfect oneness with the Father. Liveth in me. The one who did everything to the glory of God liveth in me. His life was fully for God. He liveth in me, Paul says. The one who lived a victorious life over the world and over Satan and over sin liveth in me. Oh, the marvel of those words. Christ liveth in me. In me. It is a life manifesting the living Christ. That's the Christian life. One cannot truly say, Christ lives in me, and then you live like the devil. Those two do not line up. Christ liveth in me. He liveth in me as the ruler and the moving power. And now Paul says, I live a life that springs from that. Christ liveth in me. He drives me, Paul is saying. He empowers me. He guides me. He lives His life in me and through me. Notice, it is Christ liveth in me. Not merely Christ liveth close to me or next to me, but He lives in me. To live is to be active. Christ liveth. Christ is actively inside of me, Paul is saying. Christ is doing the living in my earthen vessel, is what Paul is saying. Christ liveth in me. Oh, what a marvel. How amazing. And how we ought to long for more and more of Christ and less of I. The degree of Christ liveth in me determines the degree of I. The two go hand in hand. Sixthly, from both messages, is a life lived above the earthly. As a result of crucified with Christ, and Christ liveth in me, notice what it says. The life which I now live. And we could stop right there and preach many sermons. The life which I now live. That ought to be a place to stop and examine. The life which I now live. So he says, the life which I now live in the flesh. And then he describes how he lives this life. But again, it's not him, it's Christ. I live by the faith of the Son of God. I live by the faith of the Son of God. This life that he is describing, again, is lived in weak bodies. Bodies that are in a state of decay. Bodies that are fragile. Yet it's a life beyond that, because it's lived by faith. So there's Paul in a body of flesh. But hear him. I now live by faith. I now live by faith. Faith is for now. I now live, now, by faith. This faith sees beyond now. It's lived in now, but it sees beyond the now. It sees beyond the temporal. In other words, my life's not controlled by now. My life's not controlled by the temporal. Faith sees the invisible. Faith sees God. This faith gives reality to the invisible. This faith causes one to see, to know, and be persuaded of the spiritual realm, and to depend upon it, and to rely upon that, and to rest and cleave to that. So in those words, the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God. Paul is saying, though I live in a body of flesh, and that body of flesh is corrupt, and it's in a state of decay, and in that body I'm extremely limited, but I live seeing Him. I live by faith. I live with confidence in Him. I live depending upon Him. I live leaning upon Him. I live resting upon Him. I live cleaving to Him. I live drawing from Him. I live by the faith of the Son of God. That's descriptive of the atmosphere in which He lived. Yes, we live in these bodies. We live in this world. But we don't have to live in the atmosphere of this world. Faith takes us beyond the atmosphere of the world. And He says, that's where I live. That's how I live. It's where I live. In other words, I live above. My life's not confined to this earth because faith takes me beyond this earth. My life's not focused upon this earth. But He's saying my life is focused above. Faith has the power to take us beyond that which is earthly. And this is the life that Paul is describing. Seventhly, it is a life connected to His love for me. I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me. Who loved me. This was more than a doctrinal truth to Paul. It was personal. It was real. The Son of God who loved me. It was something that He knew. Something that He knew. Again, we all know that there are people that loves us. That's a good thing to know. But this is far beyond that. Paul lived knowing the Son of God, Jesus Christ, loved me. This was something that he experienced. He experienced His love. He could feel His love. And it affected his life. And now Paul is living his life connected and in relation to. He loves me. He loves me. He lived persuaded and convinced that he was personally and unconditionally loved by the Lord. He's describing a life lived feeling the power and fervency of He loves me. The reality of Christ's love, when it is known, not just in the head, not just as a doctrinal truth, but when it is known in our life, and it's felt personally. You say, well, I'm not worthy of His love. No one is. No one is. That's what's so great about it. But when it's known and when it's felt personally, it has a motivating power. 2 Corinthians 5:14, for the love of Christ constraineth us. And then you read on there and you see that this love compels us, that they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto Him which died and rose again. So you see, this love that He has for us motivates us. What's it motivate us to? Not I, but Christ. Not I, but Christ. If we're going to live the life that Paul sets before us, His great and unsearchable love for us must be personally experienced and felt. Eighthly, it is a life connected to Christ's sacrifice for us. The Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. This is a manifestation of His love. He loved me. As a result of that, He gave Himself for me. That's what love does. Whether it's human love, whatever. That's what love does. Love gives itself. Whether it's a husband, wife, brother, so it doesn't matter. It's a characteristic of love. Love gives itself. Christ loved me, and He gave Himself for me. It doesn't get better than that. And Paul, he's describing this life that he's living. It's a life surrendering. It is a surrendering and sacrificing love. Love surrenders. Again, it doesn't matter what realm of love we're talking about. Love surrenders. Love sacrifices. And that's what Christ did. He surrendered Himself to the cross. He sacrificed Himself for me. And Paul feels the reality of this. He feels the reality of a fact that God in a body of human flesh voluntarily leaves the glories and the majesties of heaven. And he does so for me, he says. And He took my sin upon Himself, and He went to the cross and paid that sin debt. Treated as though He were the sinner in my place. And He says, the Son of God gave Himself for me. And that has an effect on the life I live. If that's just a doctrinal idea in the head, it doesn't have much effect. But if that's real and that's personal, it's going to change our life. The Son of God gave Himself for me. Him for me. 3 wonderful words. Him for me. Himself for me. So he lived, Paul, seeing Jesus giving Himself for him. How can you, well, again, it doesn't matter what realm of love we're talking about. How can someone see another person, give themselves for them, and not return that love? How can we see Jesus Christ giving Himself for us and not give ourselves for Him? But Paul could see by faith Jesus Christ giving Himself for him. And it changed the way he lived his life. And it will. It will. Lastly, it's a life connected to the grace of God. Drop down to the next verse, verse 21. I do not frustrate the grace of God. I do not frustrate the grace of God. Paul says this is all by grace. It's not because I'm better than anyone else. It's not because I'm more deserving than anyone else. It's just simply the grace of God, the free favor of God bestowed upon me. It was by God's grace that Christ loved him. It's by God's grace that Christ loves us. It was by God's grace that Christ died in his stead. Same is true of you and I. The phrase, the grace of God, refers to God's unmerited favor. His unmerited favor toward us. And Paul says, I don't frustrate the grace of God. That is, I do not live in such a way that it appears that God's amazing grace and salvation has no influence over me at all. When grace is real, when we come to the realization of what grace is, God's free favor, changes the way you live, has an influence over you. He's saying the life that I live manifests. God's been gracious to me. There's no one on earth that can say God hasn't been gracious. God's grace has given you your first breath. God causes the sun to rise and set on the godly and the wicked. God causes the crops to grow for the godly and the wicked. God's good. But many times man lives frustrating the grace of God. That is, as if God wasn't gracious at all. Paul says, I don't live that way. God was gracious to me. God is gracious to me. And I want to manifest that in my life. How good God is. And that should be our attitude. So what we have in our text is the Christian life. What a wonderful life. What a wonderful life. What a wonderful life it is. It's the life that we can live. And it's a life that we should live. It ought to be our prayer every day. God, help me. Help me to live Galatians 2:20. Help me to do that. If I get in the way of that, Lord, just get me out of the way and help me to live that life. Not I. Not I. But Christ. And if someone along the way thanks you for kindness shown to them or whatever, you make sure you tell them, it's not me. It's the Lord. You need to thank Him. You need to thank Him. Brother Dave, if you'll come and lead us in